Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sam Bruchhaus, and welcome back to the Class Play on Sumer Sports. We're almost a month out from the draft, which means each position group is being analyzed with a closer lens. As it looks now, there's a pretty good chance that quarterbacks go at least 1 through 3, if not 1 through 4. And so before jumping into that, we want to ask ourselves, if there were no premium quarterbacks, who would top the big board? To help me answer that question, I have Tej Seth with me. How you doing, Tej?
I'm doing great. I think we're missing Ben Brown, who's really busy doing a lot of other stuff right now. But I think the two of us can hold down the fort here, talk about some non-quarterbacks, and get the people going with that type of stuff.
For sure. And if you want to help us out too, be sure to follow, subscribe, and ask questions in the chat if you are live, or ask questions via Twitter. You can reach me and Tej both on Twitter after the show. So since 2019, only quarterbacks, wide receivers, tight ends, interior defensive linemen, edge rushers, and cornerbacks have been in the top 5 of the consensus big board as tracked by NFL mock draft database. So with that in mind, we're going to focus on those positions and hit the offensive line positions a little bit as well. So Tej, let's start with wide receivers. Do you have a wide receiver that you think could potentially be at the top of a big board if there were no premium quarterbacks?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this is the wide receiver that is at the top of the big board. So, you think about March Madness and putting a bunch of 1 seeds in the Final Four. Like, this is my version of that, putting out Marvin Harrison Jr. as the top player on the big board. And, he is number 1 on the consensus big board, but you look at his production, highest yards per out run in this draft class. You look at his nearest neighbors in terms of EPA per snap and yards per out run. You have CeeDee Lamb and Devontae Smith and, players that have gone on to have very productive NFL careers. I was looking at some data from our friends at StatsBomb, and he has 18.4 yards per completion, which is the second best in this draft class. So just like complete production across the board. So I have Marvin Harrison Jr. as my top big board player out of the wide receivers.
So Tej, we talked about quarterbacks likely going 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4. Obviously, a lot of people are saying 4, 5, 6 potentially could be all wide receivers. You have Marvin Harrison Jr. first. What do you think about the order of all those 3 guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when you think about like the loser's curse and, the papers that have been written on these topics, like there is about a 44% chance that the wide receiver taken after Marvin Harrison Jr., assuming he's the first wide receiver taken, goes off to have a better career than him. That's not saying that, it's a guarantee or not a guarantee, but I think that when you play the probabilities and you look at draft curves, like that's just kind of the chance of that happening. And I think that all 3 of these receivers are pretty close together. Whereas the difference between Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Neighbors and Rome Odunze is not that big, but that is the order that I have it in, where I go Harrison Jr., Neighbors, and then Odunze after that.
Yeah, I actually disagree, but that's why I'm glad that we can debate on today's Class Play show. I'm really big on Rome Odunze. Obviously, there were concerns about kind of his speed, top end speed breaking away. We did see him have a ton of contested catches this year, but I think he kind of assuaged some of those fears in the combine. Obviously, there's the difference between combine speed and play speed, but he did have an elite RAS score, relative athletic score, running a 40 of like 4.45, 20-yard split, 2.57. So I think he's kind of assuaged some of those fears. But the reason I like him is just, you're looking at teams at 4, at 5 that have experienced quarterbacks. You're the Justin Herberts of the world, the Kyler Murrays. And I think if you're pretty comfortable with your quarterback, you can kind of get into that sphere where, you have a guy who's probably confident throwing into tight spaces, and you want a guy who can make those catches in tight spaces. And so Rome Odunze had that great contested catch rate. Obviously, he played with Michael Penix, who was one of the better, more pro-style quarterbacks who is in the draft this year. Obviously doesn't have that ceiling that some of those other quarterbacks have. But I can really see a lot of the stuff that Odunze did translate to the pros based on kind of a scouting profile, his analytics profile. That being said, interestingly, as you said, he's not consensus big board number 1 like Marvin Harrison Jr. is. He's at 6. I could actually see him dropping to a point where, like maybe he goes in the later mid first round, but still, as you said, kind of has that better career. And an interesting question that this kind of leads us into another position group that was brought up by Benjamin Robinson from Grinding the Mocks, posed towards us was, how do you kind of gauge that highest projection versus ceiling versus how he fits with the team? The best example of this in recent years is Jamar Chase versus Penei Sewell. Jamar Chase obviously went to the Bengals. They later invested in T. Higgins. Both of those players have been really, really good, and obviously they make a Super Bowl. The Lions go ahead and invest in Penei Sewell, who's just an animal at that tackle position, more of a protector, and they've also seen great returns from that decision. What is your kind of view, given that there are multiple places in this draft where a team may have to make a decision like that?
This is a great question from our friend Benjamin Robinson, talking about, the wide receiver, offensive tackle debate. And how I view it is, I like to go wide receiver, especially when you have this high end draft capital, like top 16 pick, because I think that a singular wide receiver, especially if they hit their 75th percentile outcome or higher, can do a lot more for your offense than a singular offensive tackle. I think offensive line as an entire group, because of the way they affect both the run and the pass game, might as well have more impact than a wide receiver core. But I think that when you look at it from an individual player level perspective, that wide receiver, especially if you do end up getting a good to elite wide receiver, can really change the complexion of your offense in a way that a good to elite offensive tackle can't to a certain extent.
Yeah, and it's also interesting. I think this kind of breaks down to style. Like obviously Jim Harbaugh is a very power guy. Typically would have great offensive linemen with some of those 49ers teams. And obviously Michigan was a power football team for most of the time that he's there. It'll be interesting to see how, just an approach from a coaching position actually has an effect on this. I think that the wide receivers probably are a class above this year than kind of some of those tackle positions are, but obviously like Joe Alt is a great player. And so it'll be interesting to see if there's some movement after something like a pro day. I saw a great question in the chat of how a pro day may affect Marvin Harrison Jr. I think Tej has done a great job of looking at like how some of these metrics that come out of a pro day or out of the combine affect, a draft stock, where he's on the board, so forth and so on. So Tej, do you want to go a little bit into that?
Yeah, no, this is a great question from BeatGamer99 as well. And I think it's interesting because when you look at Marvin Harrison Jr., again, like number one on the consensus big board, most big boards would have him as at least a top 3 prospect. Like, I think testing from his point of view can only really hurt him. I assume that he's gotten some assurances from teams like, maybe the Cardinals or the Patriots, even, where like they're saying like, if you are in, available and we're still in that draft pick, like we will select you. So I'm sure he has a pretty good idea of where he's going to go in the draft. And he's just, using the time to actually get ready for his rookie season instead of spending time training for the particular events he would have to do at the combine or the pro day.
Yeah, and that brings us kind of into kind of the flip side of the wide receiver, obviously on the defensive side, into a position that this year probably wouldn't really get close to that number one consensus big board position, and that's the cornerback position. Obviously, a lot of these guys are more in the middle teens in terms of where they are in the consensus big board. But the cornerback position historically has kind of jumped up into that top 5 consensus big board. There's guys like Derek Stingley, who are very well regarded going into draft season. So we wanted to touch a little bit on how the cornerback position looks this year. Tej, who's someone that jumps out to you?
Yeah, so I love Terrion Arnold from Alabama. He would be at the top of my corner list if I was a corner needy team. And he's 12th on the consensus big board. He's second behind the guy you're about to talk about. But what I really like about Arnold is he can line up in the slot or out wide. He has experience doing both. So that's a very versatile defensive back you can add to your backfield. He only allowed 4 touchdown passes in his entire college career, but had 6 interceptions. So, he was pretty good when targeted. Great tackler too. Like I definitely noticed that in the LSU Alabama game. He's someone that can really fly down from the second level. And, we love our multi-sport athletes on here. So just doing some research into his background, averaged 17 points per game in high school basketball. Someone who had a 9.14 RAS score. He was really good at, the broad jump, the 10-yard split, like a lot of the stuff that you want to see from your corner. I think that he might be a little bit skinny from a peer, like matching up against like the AJ Brown types of receivers, but I think that he can hang with most other receivers in the NFL.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that cross sport kind of profile, because obviously Quinyon Mitchell, the guy who I ID'd as someone who is probably the top cornerback in the draft. I don't think that he would be a player who you would consider with the number one pick in most drafts. Obviously not this draft. But you look at kind of his profile. Obviously, he's coming from a different place than Terrion Arnold is. Terrion Arnold, Alabama, has that kind of quote pedigree coming from a blue blood type program. Terrion Arnold's coming from Toledo, a MAC program. Typically, you're not going to see a ton of guys, jump way up into the first round from a MAC program. He currently sits at consensus big board, number 13. But I think he has all the tools to be successful. And I think it's a show that the scouts and the league have identified his talent. He's charted out extremely well, one of the best of all time in terms of charting metrics. He also stood out at the Senior Bowl. These are kind of the things you want to see from a player like this. And obviously we'd love to, I didn't do the research like Tej did on his basketball points per game, but hopefully that, maybe it matches up. Maybe we need to do something a little closer. But I expect to see a lot of development also from him as he starts facing those better players and continuing to grow. And I kind of expect him to be a guy who has a decade plus of dominance, and maybe later in his career ends up being a second corner, as we've seen, Stephon Gilmore settle in that role. That's kind of what I'm expecting from him. Maybe not the super high ceiling that someone like a Derek Stingley might have, but expecting him to have a very long NFL career. And I think that's a valuable investment at the professional level. So moving right along into another position, obviously tight end Tej. I think we're both on the same page here about Brock Bowers being kind of the power player here in the tight end market. How high do you think he's going to go? Do you think he's a great investment? What are your thoughts on Brock Bowers?
Yeah, so, because of a lot of the moves that the Jets have made this offseason, I think a lot of them have been good at making sure they have more versatility at what they're going to end up picking. Like Brock Bowers has been talked about a lot at going number 10 overall. And I could see them taking him, personally, I find it pretty tough to take tight ends in the first round, but it wouldn't be, it would kind of be like a finishing touch on the offense for them as they're kind of going all in on these last two Rodgers years here. So, I could see him going as high as that, and then also going like the 10 through 20 range if the Jets don't end up taking him. But there's so many reasons to be high on Brock Bowers. I mean, and when you look at all notable tight ends since 2014, Football Insights, put together a really cool graph on this where he has the highest yards per out run of any tight end, that was drafted since 2014. And then he also has the second highest EPA per route run, just behind Isaiah Likely. So, he's in the Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts, TJ Hawkinson type range when it comes to those metrics. And I think that, is pretty promising for his NFL career.
Yeah. As I've spoken about, the last couple of weeks, I'm really high on Brock Bowers as a prospect, but we've talked to Ben about it. We've talked to some other people. I wonder what his value in terms of like the draft construct is. Beat Gamer 99 does a great job of IDing this. He thinks that investing in Bowers over O-line for the Jets, may not be the move to make. And I wouldn't fault him for taking that position. Obviously, when you're looking at tackles in particular, you can save a lot of money and get a lot of surplus value in that first round by going with a Joe Alt, with an Amarius Mims, with some of those great tackle prospects that we're seeing over someone like a Brock Bowers, who's playing the tight end position just by pure surplus value. Now, obviously, tight ends do have kind of a longer curve. You may save some money by locking him in versus having to go get a tight end in the open market. But that being said, I think it's probably a better investment early on to go offensive line, though someone like a Brock Bowers may be a better prospect per se. Tej, how do you view kind of in terms of this class in particular, the strength of the O-line class, the strength of the wide receiver class, and the strength of obviously Brock Bowers and some of the other tight ends? How would you rank those three in terms of strength this year?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think I'm going to go wide receiver, offensive tackle, tight end. I think tight end would probably be in like the second tier, and wide receiver and offensive tackle are pretty tight because those two positions in particular, wide receiver and offensive tackle, are really interesting because there's so many different types and kind of like a choose your own adventure with these types of players where it's like you have your elite separators and your speed guys like Malik Neighbors. You have your contested catch guys like Roma Dunze. You have your slot guys, guys that can work really well outside. Like there's so many different types of wide receivers in this class that are all going to go, first round, high second round. I think that's what makes it really exciting is like, if you want a wide receiver in this draft, like there's really no excuse to walk out of the draft without a talented one. And then offensive tackle, I feel pretty similar about where like, if you do need an offensive tackle headed into this draft, you should be able to get one at some point in the first round. And you should feel pretty good about starting that offensive tackle day one, just because of the talent level at that position as well.
Yeah, I have to agree with that ranking. I think you look at the wide receivers and they have the star power at the very top and they have the depth as well. I think wide receiver is probably the position with the most star power outside of the quarterbacks, obviously. And I think they also by far have the most depth. I mean, I think you could have guys like Keon Coleman, Adonai Mitchell, so forth and so on that go day two. And then obviously even farther and deeper into those kind of day three level wide receivers. I think a lot of those guys could end up being real contributors on an NFL team within their first or second year. Beat Gamer 99 had another good point that tight ends can be found later. Most of the times tight ends don't perform well in their rookie year. That's what the research kind of shows. They have that longer development curve. That being said, the star power is there. Not as deep of a class. I think there's probably 3-4 guys who are really, really good and really can contribute at least over the first 3 years, if not farther. But you look at the star power with Bowers, and you have to say he's right up there with the Marvin Harrison Jr.'s in terms of his profile as a player. And then you look at the tackles. I think it's a notch under the star power, maybe that Brock Bowers may have or Marvin Harrison Jr. may have. But I think, like you said, that depth and the number of guys who can fill spots is really good. And I think there's actually a lot of value to be had, probably more in the day two range, but at the guard and center, obviously Jackson Powers Johnson from Oregon, I think he's going to be a lock at the next level. I think he's a very good prospect from the terms of his profile. And I think you look across the offensive line very deep this year. So from there, moving on to the defense, this was something that came up over the weekend, and me and Tej kind of have differing views. Just to finish off on the tight end probably closer to quarterback than any other position where it's situation. That is so important. Very true. Point. Very true. I mean, you see guys like George Kittle, who are able to block and receive, obviously, in that Kyle Shanahan offense, very important. But there's guys that can kind of get thrown to the wind. And we'll see how that kind of changes this year with a Kyle Pitts, obviously moving to a whole new scheme, whole new quarterback. It'll be very interesting there. Moving on to interior defensive linemen. Me and Tej kind of have a different view here of who's the best interior defensive lineman in the class. Tej, give us some insight into what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I know Johnny Newton is your guy, but I really like Byron Murphy out of Texas here. 17th on the consensus big board. He got better every year he was in college, and we know it's pretty tough to play defense in the Big 12, and I think he stepped up and did really well in that role. Last season in particular, he had 8.5 tackles for loss, 5 sacks, and he was even used on offense a couple times, which is pretty cool. He scored a rushing and a receiving touchdown, so it'll be cool to see if he can still continue that at the next level. But when you look at his performance at the combine as well, like he's not someone who's tall or big necessarily, but like he has that quickness, that explosiveness. He ran a 4.88 40-yard dash at 297 pounds. For reference, the last time I ran a 40, I ran 4.99, and I weigh, much less than he does. So, Sham Schwartzstein's in here, and he had a really good point about this, where it's like, yeah, there's not often that we'll see linemen running 40-yard dashes in the NFL, like on the actual field, but it just shows you like that they're in shape, they're in good health, and they've been caring about, their body throughout this whole process. Like, I think that he's someone that, he just looks very fit and active on the field. And I think that can carry to the next level, when he ends up getting drafted.
Yeah. And I don't get me wrong. I think Byron Murphy's a great prospect. And I think Tej did a great job of summarizing some of those points. That being said, and maybe Tej, this is me dipping into my Mel Kiper Jr., Stephen A. Smith, media Sam rather than analyst Sam, but Johnny Newton is just one of the guys I've absolutely fell in love with this year. I've watched a lot of the film for him as well, so this is more ex-player Sam probably talking than analyst Sam, though he is very well regarded by the metrics. But I love what Johnny Newton can bring to the game for a team. And I think he's going to be very usable no matter what team he goes to. And I think that can provide someone a lot of value and puts him as the top interior defensive lineman this year. Just a couple of notes I have on him. He can rush from a multitude of spots. I mean, the film has him beating tackles, guards, centers, rushing out of a 4-eye, rushing out of a 3, coming from inside in that A gap, at a 1 tech. I mean, when you have a guy that can do that, especially at his size, he weighs a lot. He's a little squatter. He's not, a 6'4", 6'5" guy. But when you get into someone who can do that, it shows so much versatility. And I just want to give props to Aaron Donald, obviously retired within the last week. That was something that entailed a lot of people to Aaron Donald is kind of that ability to use his hands, get around blocks, and play multiple positions. I'm not necessarily comparing Johnny Newton to Aaron Donald there, but I do think that positional versatility is something that is extremely valuable to teams. His hand use is what I freak out about. I love watching Dexter Lawrence film because of his hand use on an inside rush, particularly when he's lined up in that kind of zero technique over the center. Johnny Newton's hand use is so good, and it's almost like a magic trick sometimes. You see the offensive lineman set backwards and the hands go out, and all of a sudden Johnny Newton's just around him in a split second because he's chop, dip, rip those hands down and is all of a sudden right behind him making a play in the backfield. So that's kind of my spiel on Johnny Newton. I can talk about it for hours, but when you have someone who can get in the backfield quickly, muck things up for the offense, while also being, a 300+ pound player, I'm really excited to see him at the next level. So moving into the edge market, similar to the interior defensive line, another probably more premium than the interior defensive line. But this year it's an interesting mix. It's kind of a toss up. A lot of people have Dallas Turner going really high, but me and you have separate players that we view as the interior, as the top of the edge market. What do you think, Tej?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Dallas Turner is a great prospect. Obviously, I think it really comes down to preference of style and what you're looking for. And for me, like the edge that I would take first is Laiatu Latu out of UCLA. And I look at him and I look at his production last year. Led the country in tackles for loss per game at 1.8. Led the country in sacks per game at 1.08. Started every game at UCLA his 2 years there. And like, you just really have to go and watch the game against USC or even the game against, I think it was Oregon State, where he like can kind of single-handedly affect a lot of these games and wreak havoc. And I think that he's the type of guy that is going to be a very high pressure rate guy in the NFL, where he will be getting in the backfield a lot, causing the quarterback to hurry or to get off market. So, off platform. Like, I think that a lot of the stuff that he did in college at UCLA on a very good UCLA defense should be able to translate over. And that's why I'm excited for him at the next level.
Yeah, that's super exciting. I really thought about this deeply about whether Letu or someone else would be the top. I really like Letu as a prospect. I think he's really dominant, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him perform best. I think this is a tough market this year. There's a lot of good players who are very good, and I decided to go with Jared Verse, the Florida State product. He has one of the more interesting paths into the first round in the draft. He played 2 years at Albany before transferring to Florida State. And that being said, I'm not the most confident that he is going to be, the tippy top of the class in terms of production, but he's probably someone that I look at the changing landscape of college football and I try to glean an edge potentially somewhere. And, we've seen his talent be ID'd going from high school to the college ranks. Obviously, he was not super highly ranked coming out of high school, but came in, went to the FCS level, dominated at the FCS level, moved to the P5 level, dominated the P5 level for 2 years. And now NFL scouts kind of expect it to translate to the NFL level. And so as we start seeing the transfer portal open up, more guys have more games in different situations, different schemes, things like that. I think Jared Verse may be a prospect we look back at and say, hey, this is kind of the new landscape of college football. Let's try to glean as much predictiveness as we can from someone who has dominated in multitudes of different levels and has jumped to a completely different talent level from the FCS level to the ACC level and really dominated, been on some very good teams. Another thought that I also want to note, just kind of on a grander scale of this draft, is I think this Florida State team that obviously much maligned, having not made the playoffs. Obviously, a very infamous situation that will probably stick for years to come. But we love making these kind of cross-sport comparisons. I look at them a lot as the title-winning Villanova teams from years ago in terms of basketball. And the reason why I say that is because you look at those Villanova teams in terms of basketball, and now 4 of those guys are quality starters on NBA teams. And looking back then, they seem to be players with kind of strange backgrounds. They had been in college for a long time. All of them had near flaws. Most of them went middle, late first round, second round in the NBA draft. And it turns out that they just had, a certified all-star, Jalen Brunson. They had Mikal Bridges, who's a starter on a finals team, DiVincenzo, all these guys that just actually turned out to be great talents. And so you look at this Florida State team and kind of who the names in the draft are. And you look at Jared Verse, originally went to Albany, made it up to Florida State and dominated. You look at Braden Fisk, also another transfer that wasn't heralded for several years. And all of a sudden he's at Florida State. He's dominating. He's putting on a show at the combine. You look at Johnny Wilson, 6'7", another transfer coming in. Jaheim Bell, undersized tight end. Think he's going to make an impact at the next level. And then even Jordan Travis, the quarterback, I wouldn't be surprised to see him at least have some impact, whether that's as a backup quarterback or whether he jumps to the starter level. I wouldn't be surprised to see him bring some value to a team at that point, maybe if he gets selected later in the draft as an undrafted free agent. So that's kind of my grander thought on that Florida State team that I kind of wanted to float out there, that this could be something of a bellwether for things to come, of a kind of a hodgepodge of talent coming together and dominating college football, still being undervalued, and then a lot of those players going on to compete at the NFL level. So Tej,
that's a great analogy, honestly. You look at Florida State last year and you talk about Jared Verse, and especially that Louisville ACC championship game where they're on their 3rd quarterback of the season and they end up winning that game because their defensive line played one of the best games you'll ever see from a defensive line. I think Verse and Fisk and the talent they had there is a big part of that. And then you're right. You look at the other side of the ball as well. And Mike Norvell's ability to use the transfer portal to bring all of this talent together. Keon Coleman was someone who looked really good at Michigan State, but didn't necessarily have a quarterback. Norvell offered him that opportunity, and now he's going to be a receiver that's going to be taken in the first round here. Where it's you can see how the transfer portal can affect these draft stocks over time. Whereas if Coleman stayed at Michigan State and maybe still didn't get good quarterback play, he might be getting taken in the second round. Like the production wouldn't have been there, the highlight reel wouldn't have been there. So it's cool to see how that can affect someone's draft capital.
Yeah, I think it's extremely exciting, and it will be interesting to see how, the transfer market moves forward, whether that provides more predictiveness or whether it's just maybe it adds noise. We don't know. It's a new thing. Tej, what are your thoughts on maybe you see a guy jump around, you see a guy succeed? Obviously, Jaden Daniels, a guy that we both really like, transferred, didn't have a ton of success at Arizona State, ended up bouncing to LSU and becoming the Heisman. Do you think that something like that shows you something about the NFL, or you think it may just add noise?
No, that's a good question to bring up. My original prior on this, like a couple of years ago, before the explosion of the transfer portal, was that if someone was transferring, and especially if it was from, a high end, like blue chip type school to maybe like a middle of the pack one, like that was a little bit of a yellow flag on their profile. Because of like maybe they just weren't able to compete at that new school. But now that I've seen more examples of this over time, I've evolved that opinion where I think if you transfer and you're productive in two different schools, two different environments, that's a really good indictment on what you could be at the next level, because we think about separating players from situation all the time. And the transfer portal gives us that, kind of like alternate look into what would happen if that player move spots. Like I think I was talking to a friend at a team about Bo Nix, and we were saying like, Bo Nix's stats, like his sack rate and his time to throw and his completion percentage and like all that stuff, like look good across the board. But we only saw Bo Nix play well at Oregon. We didn't see him play that well at Auburn. So like, how much weight are you putting into those two different environments? And I think like when you see a player play well at both environments, like that is pretty promising for the next level.
Yeah, and you brought it to the quarterback position. I think that's great, because you look across this quarterback class, and most of them have transferred. Caleb Williams showed some pretty early success at Oklahoma, won the Heisman at USC. Jaden Daniels, not as successful at Arizona State, won the Heisman at LSU. Bo Nix obviously made some plays at Auburn, not as successful, moves on to Oregon, very, very successful. Michael Penix Jr., someone who was on an Indiana team, and they said he was carrying the team on his back. I consider that a success. Then blows it out of the park at Washington, making a national championship this year. Another great comment in the chat. Will on Twitter says Adonai Mitchell coming from Georgia to Texas. That's another one of someone who, we may have not seen it a ton at Georgia, very successful at Texas. Tej brought up a good point about trying to contextualize change and the change that may happen going to the NFL. I think this is definitely something to watch in the next couple years. So thank you for joining us. We're going to move into our class play picks. Obviously, every week we pick some of our favorite draft picks. We've done running back, D-line, wide receiver. Tej, your running backs are Christian McCaffrey and DeAnthony Thomas, D-lineman and Ndamukong Suh, wide receiver Tavon Alston and Justin Blackmon. This week we're doing cornerbacks. Who's one of your favorite cornerback draftees of all time?
Yeah, I mean, I like both of our teams so far. So going to try to add to that and put together this super team here. I'm going to go with Denzel Ward. As a prospect, I loved him when he was in college. I thought that he did a great job at Ohio State. Like, again, like you talk about someone who's versatile, able to play both positions. There's some stat about him where he went between Ohio State and the NFL. He went 5 straight years without allowing, over 70 yards of receiving in a single game, which I think about like the passing environments that these corners live in right now. Like that's very impressive. And so, he's someone that I think has done well at the next level, got a very deserving extension from the Browns and was someone coming out of college that, I was all over and thought deserved to go very highly in the draft.
Yeah, Denzel Ward's a great pick there. I'm actually going to pick someone who was drafted as a corner and ended up not playing corner. I don't know if that's cheating. I guess it's my own game here, so I'm going to call it as not cheating. But I picked Malcolm Jenkins, and the reason I picked Malcolm Jenkins is because he comes in as a corner and then moves to safety, obviously, in his earlier years with New Orleans, then going into Philly. And I know I may be playing, New Orleans, Louisiana bias here, but I really love those years in Philly where he kind of turned into kind of a new wave type safety as the league evolved kind of from the beginning of his career in 2009 into the mid 2010s, where safeties had to basically be able to cover. They had to be able to tackle. He played a little bit of high safety, moved into a strong safety role later in his career where he was basically a mix of, a cover linebacker, a nickel back. He played many positions over the course of his career. And I think he's just a great pick. Obviously for New Orleans, where he, was an AP player, second team, couple Pro Bowls, a lot of good seasons, Super Bowl, etc. So my pick is Malcolm Jenkins to add to my team of Reggie Bush, Al Woods, Barkevious Mingo, Des Bryant, and Michael Crabtree. So Tej, any last words on your thoughts on this consensus big board on the best players before we move into quarterbacks in the following weeks?
I do love your Malcolm Jenkins pick. I mean, you're right. Like it's cool that we saw him play so many different positions throughout his career, where he started at corner his rookie year, moved to free safety, experimented with strong safety a little bit before like closing his career on that. And like, to see a career last 13 years, like his did, and like for him to be able to handle all those positions, like I think it's really interesting. And like, I think someone like Cooper DeJean has been talked about as someone who could maybe make the switch from corner to safety. So I hope that he is able to kind of look at Malcolm Jenkins and what he did and, make that decision with his coaching staff when it comes to that.
Yeah, that's a great thought. Cooper DeJean was someone that I gave a close eye to when we were talking about cornerbacks. Ended up going with Quinyon Mitchell, but I think he's someone who could definitely fit in that mold and a very interesting prospect, round one, round two. And so Tej, thank you for joining me, man. Exciting to talk about this consensus big board players outside of quarterbacks. Obviously, in the next couple of weeks, guys, we're going to be focusing in on quarterbacks. We love all the questions. We love the participation. Feel free to hit me on Twitter at Bruchhaus Sports. Tej, you want to plug your Twitter and anything else you'll be working on?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at TEJFB Analytics. And then, yeah, just keep listening to the Class Play and some of the other Sumer podcasts that we have.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. And from Tej Seth and from Sam Bruchhaus, thank you very much and have a great one.